first talk this morning is Angie Thompson from the University of Texas at Austin, with her talk entitled Testing a New Procedure for Removing Aged Consolidants from Historic Collections.
Good morning. Thanks everyone for coming out. Can you hear me okay? Now, at the Non-Vertebrate Paleontology Lab at UT Austin, we have a very large historic collection. You'll see this quote behind me. We see this: "The bone won't be in any danger of falling apart before we're ready to take it from the ground." Our historic collections are covered in these once good ideas that have turned an absolute nightmare. One of the issues that we deal with our historic collections is that we don't have very good records for what was done to the specimens. And when the records are present, they're not very precise. Oftentimes we come across shellac, will be true shellac, tree resin, animal glue, or any of these synthetic resins. We also have the same issue with glue. What kind of glue? Now, it's important for us to know these things because these shellacs, these glues, that's a little out of order, are at some modern conservation problems. Now, what we see is these shellacs 80 years ago had a really good purpose. They consolidated the specimen. They were able to keep it safe during transport. But now, this slide got deleted. That's what happened. These consolidants crack, and they sometimes penetrate through the fossil and cracking and actually damaging the fossil underneath. They also darken to the point where you just cannot see the actual specimen underneath. It makes measuring almost impossible. They also do a lot of peeling and flaking, and these consolidants that were used cross-link rapidly at room temperature. Now here, this is our warehouse where part of our collection is stored. We do have a nice climate-controlled area, but with invertebrate fossils, you tend to have the bulk issue. We have a very large warehouse that has no climate control, no heat, no air conditioning. With these aged consolidant in an environment like this, the heat and humidity leads to an even more rapid and dramatic deterioration of a lot of these consolidants. And it's in this area where we find the most dramatic examples of aged consolidants. Now, our historic collections, we have a little over a century's worth of collections at NPL. These three historic collections, they're all very large and they're all very important. They tend to represent localities that are no longer able to be collected from, for either they've eroded away or there's been a highway put over them. We're able to bring over one of these collections. Because of the size, we can't bring all of them over. Bringing these collections from the warehouse into the nice climate-controlled area, we're going to be doing aged consolidant removal as part of this process. Now, normally for removing these consolidants, what you're going to want to do is apply some sort of chemical solvent, soften the shellac, and then once it gets softened, you scrape it off with a pin vise. That doesn't really work for invertebrates. The marine invertebrates, fossil shells, they're calcium carbonate, which is very soft. Either of its forms are also very soft, very brittle, and invertebrate fossils are incredibly susceptible to their environment. Having them in the warehouses is pretty bad for them. There we go. Sorry. Now, for the first step for this project, we had to get these consolidants tested because the records, they're just not there. We took 3 samples from each of those historic collections, and Julian Carter at the Museum of Wales was doing his own research at the time with aged consolidants, and he offered to test some of our specimens. So we sent the 9 samples to him for infrared spectroscopy, and he came back with, there was a variety of different consolidants used, but these ones, this is the Rio Bravo collection, all of them were this copal and sandrac mixture. Now, because all 3 specimens were this same exact composition, and we didn't find that in any of the other sets, we decided that the Rio Bravo collection was going to be where we would start removing the shellac from. Now, what this allowed us to do was we're able to look at variables like surface texture and pH of the consolidant remover, instead of having this unknown variable of, is it nitrocellulose acetate, is it PVA, what was used? Now this collection is at high risk. It's over in the cages. We call them the cages because that's literally what they are. It's a very giant cage with a huge sliding door. We had 3 specimens selected for each trial, a smooth, a rough, and a friable one. And we performed 4 trials total. Now this formula comes from the Williams and Doyle paper for removing aged consolidant from teeth for microwear analysis. The formulations that we use, this is the full amount. These are half amounts. The full amount, of course, is a whole lot. This formulation came out very acidic. With our calcium carbonate material, we really wanted to steer away from acidic stuff. So we added an extra 10 milliliters of ethamine to raise the pH. We stopped once we added about 10 extra milliliters because we wanted to keep it close to the formulation that was originally mentioned in the Williams and Doyle paper. The next trial that we did, this was half amounts, but we decided the Williams and Doyle paper mentioned this formulation with this pH. Our materials were getting close to the end of their shelf life, so we think that that kind of led to some pH variation with our stuff. But with this one, we decided we were going to go straight out. We're going to go for the 8.5 pH. And in doing so, we had to add an additional 45 milliliters of ethamine. This led to a consolidant remover that was very thick, very difficult to work with, and it really wasn't very effective. Considering how much ethamine we had to add, obviously the solvents got diluted. It was just a mess. This one worked wonderfully, but with a pH of 6, of course it's going to. Now, because the formula that worked was too acidic for us to move forward with, and the basic formulation didn't really work, we wanted to kind of find one that was neutral, that worked, that got all of the consolidant off without leaving behind a residue. What we wound up doing was the carbapol and water. We mixed that together first and took half of that amount and added to the full amount of ethamine and half of the original solvent. This was able to get us a neutral 7.0 pH consolidant remover that came off cleanly and was really effective. Applying the gel was pretty straightforward. We just globbed it on a toothbrush and dabbed it over the specimen. We put cheesecloth over the consolidant remover because this would allow us to, have some sort of backing to inspect visually. We bound the specimen in a tight plastic bag, or we tried just leaving a piece of plastic over the top. As you can see, that didn't really work. Then we have to let the specimen sit for 15-20 minutes. Removing the gel, also pretty straightforward. We scraped a bit of it off onto the cheesecloth and looked to make sure that there was no shell material. Then we took a bristle brush and scraped off the shellac. Now, in this picture, you can see that's one of those white bristle brushes. This turned out to be a little bit too rigid for our uses. It actually marred some of the specimens. So we wound up getting some acid brushes and just trimming them off and using those. We inspected the specimens under a microscope to make sure that the consolidant came off, the residue was going away, and if we needed to, we gave them a second treatment. Now, about the residue, we were able to get it off with a slightly damp brush and some water, and that worked wonderfully. Using acetone was a mess. It was horrible. It just spread goop around. It was pretty gross. Now, you can see the results are pretty dramatic. This is the acidic formulation. Here we have this yellow, cracking consolidant all over the specimen. And here it's nice and clean. We have a little bit of residue, but not much. The basic formulation, this one did not function properly at all. It did sort of remove the consolidant, but there was some pretty, I don't know what that is pointing at this point. You see here, there's that discoloration in the matrix. This is the only specimen that happened to, but that was still pretty alarming. There was also an incredible amount of consolidant still stuck to the specimen. These are some images from the final formulation, the one that was wonderful to work with, easy to get everything off. Actually, that one worked so well that we decided to pull another set of specimens and just run the test again to make sure that we could get the same results. This series was selected because it was the same consolidant, but it was applied so thickly. It looks like chocolate was poured over these specimens. And this is what it looks like after you remove the consolidant. It's just amazing. Here's the rough specimen. The neutral formula did manage to pull, even out of all these cracks and crevices, all of that consolidant. This is the friable one. We were worried with our fragile and friable specimens that removing the shellac would just kind of cause them to pop and deteriorate. Thankfully, it didn't. This is also an example of why you put an undercoat on before writing on a specimen. Here on top of the consolidant, they put the number, the specimen number, and the locality number. And when we took it all off, the specimen number came off and the parentheses came off. Now, we do have some concerns. The procedure takes 20 minutes. You can do kind of a conveyor belt thing where you put it on 7 specimens and then come back and start over and start scraping it off. But it's still 20-minute wait time, and you can only do so many at once safely, because if you try to apply gel to too many, then you're going to wind up with the specimens having the stuff on them for 25, 30 minutes while you're scraping off residue from the first few. Again, we are concerned about the destabilization of the specimens. These specimens were consolidated for a reason. We saw in that quote from Roland T. Bird, the shellac, it was a cure-all. These glues were put on for a reason. Sometimes it was just aesthetic, but sometimes it was to keep a specimen from falling apart. And here we are 80 years later having to remove what is keeping the fossil held together. So it has to be done very carefully, and you have to really approach it with a strong conservation aspect of do no harm. From just a collection management standpoint, the markings all get drawn up into the consolidant. So you'll have, with these old specimens, you'll have people writing, taxonomic names, locality numbers, things that aren't necessarily in catalog. When you put this consolidant remover on that, that information's gone. So it has to be very carefully documented before you do anything to them. Also, long-term conservation plan. These fossils have a chemical process that's being done to them. We're putting consolidant remover on them. We are scraping it off with a brush. This information, the chemical formula for what you use to take the consolidant off, has to become part of the specimen. It's as much a part of the specimen as its taxonomic name. It's important to keep this information because we don't know the effects of the residue. Most of the residue came off pretty cleanly, but that doesn't mean there are traces that we can't see. This is from the basic trial. Here you can see a lot of consolidant is left on that yellow shellac. And also in the process of scraping it off with the brush, the markings that were on it broke up and got ground into the surface texture. So we have to wonder, in 50 years, what is this residue going to do to this fossil? In our trials, we were able to isolate 3 risk categories. We have a lower risk. That's interesting. These are the smooth surfaces, the ones like you see these vernicardia. They have a very regular surface with no undercuts. The ridges are straight up and down. Those are all very nice to treat because you can pull the shellac off, any consolidant off, very concisely. And it comes off like a dream. On the opposite end of that scale is the rugose specimens. That's weird, I put a pipe in front of every last one of them. These are the specimens that are, have really crenulated surfaces, a lot of undercuts, a lot of pockets for consolidant to hide and the consolidant remover to hide. Those are, I don't recommend doing those. They're difficult to work with, they're difficult to remove all the consolidant from, and it's worth mentioning, Williams and Doyle got their formulation from the Getty Institute. They developed this initially for removing aged consolidant from oil paintings. Now, the Getty they have loads of money. They were able to target all of the components of these formulations, and they found that the residue the volatile material rapidly leaves the residue. And what's left behind is equivalent to just touching an oil painting 10 times with an ungloved hand. That doesn't sound very bad, but that's oil paintings. These are fossils. We don't understand this residue in context of porous fossil material. So it is definitely worth being very cautious. Now, wrong button. Middle of the road, these friable specimens, the ones that are showing signs of distress. They're cracking, they're peeling. What we were able to find was, this takes a long time, but working in quadrants, you remove consolidant from one area, reconsolidate, remove consolidant from another area, reconsolidate. You're able to limit the damage that gets done to the specimen from things shifting around. All right, and that is. I would just like to thank really quickly Todd Ellis. He was very important in getting this whole thing started and going off the ground. Julian Carter, who was wonderful and did the spectroscopy readings for us. Matt Brown and Ann Molyneux for all of the guidance and editing. Also, the grant that all of this work is being done under is an open access grant. And in keeping with the spirit of that, I've made all of the lab notes, all of the additional images, observations. There's a lot of stuff up there. At our website, it's utexas.edu, TMM, projects, conservation, and it's, this is the link right there. And that will bring you to an HTML of this whole slideshow presentation and all of our lab notes. All right, thank you. Are there any questions?
Angie.